Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of FC Build on how to market software. For those of you who are new to Foundation, we're an early stage venture capital firm with more than 30 IPOs to our credit. Our two primary investment areas are enterprise and fintech. Within enterprise, we've invested in everything from applications all the way through to infrastructure and everything in between across the stack. We're predominantly a seed and Series A investor, mostly investing in companies that don't have product or don't have revenues. Our goal is to find extraordinary dreamers and work with them to make those dreams come true. And so if that describes you, call me or one of my partners, and we'd love to talk. But enough of my infomercial. I want to switch gears and talk about how to market software with two extraordinary marketing leaders that we have with us today. I'm excited to have Robin and Peter. Robin began her career in product marketing with Symantec and then had a very successful run in security at Imperva as an EVP and GM. She then joined VMware, where, Robin, you were CMO for 7 years in an industry where the average tenure of a CMO of a large company is probably 18 to 24 months.
Yep, I would say that's probably average. So I definitely had a few 9 lives there at VMware.
That's quite a run. And now Robin's an independent board member at several companies, including Iron Mountain, which is public, and Cohesity, one of my portfolio companies. Thank you for joining us today, Robin.
I'm really excited to be here.
Peter is a very rare combination of startup and large company experience. Peter's been at 4 different startups and part of 5 different acquisitions. He's also been at Symantec, Sun, Citrix, Cisco, and VMware as a result of some of those acquisitions. He then went on to AWS, where he ran marketing for open source projects before becoming the CMO of MongoDB earlier this year. And Peter's been a great advisor to one of my portfolio companies, Stacklet. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Yeah, Shu, thanks for having me today.
Well, thank you for joining us. Both of you have such rare experience in marketing infrastructure software in particular, which is much harder than most applications, which are easier to describe in business terms. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your experience with positioning, because I think that's one of the hardest things for infrastructure software companies. Robin, maybe you can start with an example of a company getting positioning right and how you went about that.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I do think that positioning is hard. It's also one of the most important ingredients to driving success in a marketplace. It really is such a critical dimension to your strategy. And so I think it's definitely worthy of the topic. I thought about this, and I have a really good example. It goes back a little bit, but it's super relevant. VMware was wildly successful, built its business on the backs of the concept of virtualization, 85% market share, just boom, 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 success, success, success. All of a sudden, and this is, goes back 10 years, but, this little thing called cloud started getting traction and taking off. And it was the talk of the conversation, it was just the conversation in the market. And VMware was boxed out of it because nobody really thought of VMware as a cloud company, nor did they associate the concept of virtualization with the concept of cloud computing. When in reality, the things that virtualization did were actually the enabling technologies that allowed cloud to develop. So we were in this really serious conundrum, and it was through really rigorous positioning and messaging that we were able to associate. It was kind of like a multi-step journey. First, we had to associate virtualization with the enablement of cloud. And then we had to differentiate our value proposition on top of that. And that was a whole lot of work and, frankly, years. It ended up, Peter, you will remember some of this because it survived well into your era at VMware. We built a architecture that kind of evolved over the years, but still became the primary VMware story, kind of a one-slide version of our story. And if anybody's seen in the market, it's any application running on any cloud, consumed by any device, secured. And it was this architecture that really kind of summed it all up. And without, taking up a lot of time to go into the details, I'll just say that didn't just come because one week we were there playing around with how do we position the company. That was actually a long years of progression to land. But that architecture endured probably, I would say it's probably going on 7-8 years now. So anyway, a really important, and I think we could all say that VMware navigated that transition from just virtualization to being relevant in cloud. No one would say it's a cloud company, but they certainly are perceived as relevant in the cloud era.
Now that's a great story, and as you said, it's something that took many iterations, and it was a journey. And I think that's one of the unique things about great positioning statements. When you see them, they seem obvious, but they're not. They happen over time, and it takes.
And you iterate, you test, you respond, you tweak, and I think that's a really, we should maybe talk about. Let Peter go here first, but I think that process is a really important dynamic of the journey of getting to great positioning and messaging. And sometimes we think we're just going to come out, it's going to be perfect, and on we go, forget it. But you're also balancing, don't move off it too soon, because maybe you got to get it to stick a little bit. So anyway, a deeper conversation, but I'll pause.
And we'll come back to it for sure. Peter, would love to get your perspective. What's an example of a company getting positioning right?
Absolutely. And I mean, look, positioning isn't necessarily a science. It's exactly what Robin said. The market is never in a single state. It's always evolving. And so your positioning statement will most likely evolve with that. I think what's clear is, any positioning statement should focus entirely around what are you trying to solve? What's the business outcome, not the technical outcome? And how does it play in a competitive situation? How are you different than the market? So I'll actually draw an opposite point of view to what Robin just talked about, because at cloud.com, we were building effectively virtualization software that helped solve for sprawl in the data center. And our number one competitor would be a VMware, or would be a CA or a BMC, or these big players that were super established. And so we had to come up with that believable aspirational message that painted a picture of where we were going and what it brought for customers. So in our case, knowing exactly what Robin said, that people were still kind of challenged with, is virtualization cloud, and how does this all play together? And the fact that some of the number one players were still kind of mired in the whole fake cloud, false cloud narrative that was being created by AWS at the time. And so we came out with a fairly straightforward business value prop that was build, run, and operate your data center like AWS, Google, and Microsoft. And it ultimately was that vision of data center technologies were changing. We had to get better about operationalizing our developers and enabling self-service, and really kind of taking all the pros of what you got in the cloud, but under the controls of our own data center. And that was the technology that we built. We repositioned virtualization management into the where the market was going at the time, which was very cloud forward. And that gave us a leg up for a period of time against VMware, while they were in the process of kind of redefining themselves as relevant players in the cloud. So I think that's the power of a really good positioning statement, is make it believable but aspirational, and focus on the business value that customers are trying to solve for today, and then evolve with that over time as you iterate and the market changes.
Peter, you said a couple of things that really stand out for me, and so I'm going to repeat them for the founders listening. It's this balance between believable today and aspirational, and it's this balance between articulating what you do, but also doing it in the context of what customers value.
Correct.
Against speeds and feeds. So often you see positioning statements or marketing from a company that's all about speeds and feeds, and for most customers, that's hard to relate to. Robin, you were going to say something.
Yeah, there's another dimension to what I think, Peter, you're saying that is, I think, so difficult. When you talk business outcomes, by the very nature of that aspiration, you just ripped out a whole bunch of really cool differentiated words that you like to use when you're in the tech. And it's really hard when you get into the business outcomes to get that differentiation to really soar, because, hey, save time, save money. It starts to sound very diluted. And I think that's where the power of your marketing teams and your, brilliance in marketing can really get to that essence. It's business outcome, but it's still differentiated. And that is actually a lot harder than it sounds on the surface.
It is. And maybe, a good way to talk about it would be to talk about a couple of examples of bad positioning. Robin, you want to take on any, a mistake you've made in your time, or companies you've advised or seen, something you look at and said,
I have a big one. And I wasn't actually, not that I don't have them when I was a CMO, but this time I was kind of the number 2 in marketing. I wasn't the number 1, but it's a big one. And I want to put a caveat on this. That first of all, I was part of it, but even the leader that was at the helm is one of the best marketers I've ever worked with in my career. The team that did this are some of the brightest marketers I've ever had the pleasure of being associated with. So the reason why I tell you that is it's not that bad marketers deliver bad positioning and good marketers deliver good positioning. Sometimes you just get it wrong. And we should talk about what are the signals that tell you, whoops, maybe this isn't quite right. So I literally had to go Google this because it was so in my memory, but I couldn't remember the exact words. Here is the positioning statement, and get ready for your cringe. VMware, energizing your business through IT, optimizing financial energy, shifting human energy, and saving the Earth's energy. Increase business energy while saving energy.
Ooh.
Now that, let me tell you kind of, first of all, the spirit of such energy, okay, obviously trying to be different, provocative. Wow, there is this common thread. If you really think about energy in a different way, you can see how a marketer could see some opportunity in this. Here were the signals that told us that it was wrong and that we had to back off it. First of all, when you're differentiating messaging, it still needs to be consumed and understood.
Yep.
Watch when people hear your messaging, and they might need to dig a little bit. So it's not that it has to be like first drop and it's perfect, but if they stumble too much and ask too many questions and they're kind of just stuck at the high level, they're not getting to the essence of the meaning, warning, you might be too creative, too out there, too outside what they're expecting to hear and understand. So that was one. We had to keep explaining to people. The second indicator was the sales organization never embraced it. When your sellers are resisting, okay, there's some resistance because they just don't like change.
Yeah.
But when they literally care about your business, and you know these are the guys that usually take stuff out into the field, but they just don't feel comfortable with it, doesn't sit right on them, warning, warning, warning. Something isn't resonating for them. And then the third red flag we got, and of course this takes a little time to figure this out, is even the marketers couldn't quite repeat it right. They would stumble and they would mix this up and they would kind of get confused on which energy, is it through IT or is it saving Earth? And when people can't simply replay your messaging, maybe it's a little bit too out there. So anyway, I think that was a belly flop on our part, and no, you got to learn and you got to figure it out fast and retool and move forward.
No, that's a great example, and I think you said it well. So often the best teams come up, with just things that don't work, and it's
trying to be different.
You're trying to be different. You're trying to be creative. You're trying to take a very technical product and talk about it in terms of the world will care. And sometimes you abstract it to a level. I mean, I see this all the time with founders. They'll talk about the product in terms. I'm like, so what do you do again?
Yeah, like are you PG&E? What exactly?
Peter, I'm sure you have a bunch of stories of your own.
Gosh.
What's an example of really bad positioning?
I can probably litter an entire newspaper with various positioning statements that I screwed up. What I'm going to do differently is step back and say one of the biggest challenges I think a lot of founders experience. And by the way, this is like when I go through all of the startups I've been part of, I've almost hit this consistently, is not understanding the difference between a mission statement, a vision statement, and a positioning statement, and trying to do them all together at once, which ends up becoming super complex and not very tangible in the market, or trying to be really creative and cutesy, to Robin's point, artsy, to where you're saying something, but you're not really saying anything. And I'm going to lean on that one right now, because there's a very real example just in, top of mind for me on that front. Now, everybody loves the, Apple Think Different, or, there's various iterations of that. But Apple took years before they could actually make that statement. And if you go back to early days of Apple positioning and taglines, it was, hey, get $10,000 worth of copy editing technology for under $1,000. right? It was literally be as great as the pros for 1/10 the cost. They had years of telling people exactly what they were and how they were solving problems, to where now they can come out with this justifiable think different.
Great point.
So when I first joined MongoDB a couple of months ago, we were making a big push on a brand campaign. And, it's kind of that mix of tagline, positioning statement, et cetera. And the team come together with something that could be a lot of fun, build your future faster, but at a time when nobody necessarily knew exactly what we were doing, right? We have very passionate users, 31,000 customers out there, numbers of developers basing their technologies on ours, but that's a fraction of who we are trying to go get to. And so when you come out with these abstract, build your future faster type statements, the end result is you're leaving an audience with, well, are you a financial institution, an academic institution? Oh, you're a database. I never would have put those things together. So I think they're just in bad positioning statements where you have the challenges are you're either too abstract or you're so narrow in the technology that you have that I can't see the forest through the trees. Or you get statements that are very hand wavy. Right? Save cost and time, innovate faster, without actual proof points that help the customer understand what are you actually trying to solve. And ultimately, it's build that alignment, that tangible relationship between what your positioning is and what business problem you're solving. And when you find that, that's what's great. And it's the ones that don't do that tend to fall flat. And like I said, I've got yards of history of doing the same thing. But when you find that position that resonates with the customers, to Robin's point, the sellers, is believable and very tangible, that's how you find a great position.
Maybe we should talk about a little bit about sort of, this process, Robin, you alluded to, of iterating and figuring out what works, what doesn't. But to the extent that it's possible, do it in the context of a very early stage company. Because, Peter, your point around right positioning for the right stage of the company, I think, is a critical one. As you have more awareness, as you have a much bigger presence, you also have much more creative license. Early on, you have a lot less creative license. So curious, either of you can go first. What advice do you have for a founder that probably has, 20, 25 customers, a handful of salespeople, probably one, maybe two marketing people in their team? How should they go about this exercise of figuring out the right positioning and iterating and eventually converging on something that they go to market with?
Peter,
Robin, you want to start, or do you want me to start? Okay. It's interesting. I think customers will tell you what they want. Mm-hmm. They will tell you how they're using your technologies to solve their business problems. If you're finding yourself in a position where you have your first 5, 10, 15, 20 customers, the more time you spend with them to find that common thread and really kind of dig in on what you're solving for them, not how great your technology is or why you're better than the competition or any of that other stuff. What are you doing for the customers that make them love your product? And when you find that love, that becomes kind of the core point of your positioning statement. And now you also have the proof to back it up, because many of these customers, especially your first ones, they'll become that peer proof point for sharing within industries. They can become your biggest evangelists and advocates in the market. And there's nothing more powerful than a positioning statement that's told by your customer or told by someone else in the market. So that's usually where I've leaned in. Whether it's in a large company or a startup, to really spend the time with the customers, stop thinking about why you think your technology is cool, and capture why they think your technology is cool. And you'll be surprised what you can turn, that into from a marketing perspective.
So a couple thoughts there. First of all, it's an incredible opportunity to be in front of your customers. And later, as things scale, you'll find that you get to touch fewer and fewer. So it's a great opportunity. And I would say take full advantage of it and be very present with your customers. I think if you're trying to look for what are the needles in the haystack, this is what I think is super important at this early stage. You have this realm of possibility that is so vast. Your technology could be this, it could be that, it could do this. And you've got this incredible, you've built something with amazing potential. it's really important that you don't squander that potential by going after too many use cases, by going after too many segments of customers, by going after too many business problems and business outcomes, even though you have that potential.
And that aspiration, yeah.
I think these early customer wins and these early learnings need to be focused on what are the use cases that are popping that I could rinse and repeat and I could find at scale. What are the triggers that make this customer take action today? As opposed to, hey, I buy into philosophically, cool platform, like the technology. That's really, I think that's going to be really important. But I'm not writing a PO. What makes a customer stop what they're doing, prioritize this among their budget, take their IT resource, whatever resources, and apply it to implementing? What are the triggers that make them motivated to do that? And I think these early customers, it's vital that you kind of get an opinion, even if you're not sure, at least get a thesis on what that is. And then every stage that you scale, you should be testing that thesis and validating it. Is it working? Is it sticking? Are you finding more of those use cases, more of customers with those triggers and motivations? Because otherwise you can quickly scale and be ahead of that and spend a lot of your capital, unfortunately, in probably the wrong way. And it can just really slow down your growth if you get that wrong.
Yeah, no, I think, Robin, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And, in my experience at board meetings, one of the things I've seen work is trying to find a way to anchor the board meetings around customer stories. It's very easy to get board meetings can get very theoretical and very conceptual and talk about the vision. But the more you can get the board meeting and therefore the team and everyone to say, look, what are the repeatable use cases we're seeing? Why are these customers buying? What are they doing? What causes companies to buy in 3 months versus others that are buying in 9 months? And in that culture, I think then naturally, even without necessarily sort of a formal marketing process, starts to sort of surface. Where do we have product market fit, for example? And therefore, what is the positioning that will help us then take that initial product market fit and make it a rinse and repeat process?
I also think it helps you segment your market, because you want to try to find like populations of those target customers, those personas. And, I think we can just get consumed with, especially digital, right? Because you can kind of attract all these eyeballs and all this, traffic, but are you really getting the profile of people that are ideal? And the more you can, in a sense, the more you can narrow, the better you can target and hopefully measure and track your opportunity and conversions.
I think so. You kind of bring up product market fit, which I think is a really, it's the, what's the term? It's an interesting spot for founders, especially when dealing with board members, because we know that as a founder looking to get investment, if I'm not coming into foundation cap, maybe you guys are better than most, but if we're not coming in with the $1 billion idea, then, you're not going to get the money. And the hard part is the $1 billion idea isn't necessarily the right go-to-market for you as you get started. And I think Robin's dropped some really good nuggets there with regards to really identify your core market that you want to start with and then expand from there. You obviously want to paint that picture to $1 billion, but now build the phases. What's your first $1 million? What's your first 10, 50, 100, et cetera? And what does it take to get there? And sometimes what you'll find is what you believed was product market fit actually missed a key ingredient. I'll give you an example of that, of a company I was part of, Pure Networks. Now, if you think about it, at the time, this is probably about 12, 13 years ago. Broadband was on the upswing into the home, multi-device homes, sharing printers, all that other stuff. It was literally impossible. And so this company got together and product market fit. I've got a set of customers who can't use their networks. They want to share a printer. They're not doing well. I'm going to sell to them this technology, and I have it. And they built the best personal home networking management software you could imagine. However, what they didn't factor in was once you solve it, there's no ongoing need to keep using that technology. And so when they built this model of broad growth, they said, we're going to, freeware, try it once, see that it works, and then pay as you go on. That doesn't work because
there was no as you go on.
I don't need it anymore. And what was interesting was, they had grown to about 4 million in revenue. How they got to 4 million, I'm still a little surprised, but 4 million in revenue, flat for a number of years, and they burn through marketers, burn through CEOs, et cetera. And so I was brought in by the board to go sit and help them. How do we get out of this? How do we grow this into something else? And the one thing that I think is important for founders to realize is sometimes the problem you're solving or the customer you've targeted is not the one that has the biggest pain point. So find the biggest pain point in the cycle. That's actually where your true market fit ends up being. In the case of Pure Networks, you go to the device manufacturers, the Linksys routers or Belkins or what have you of the world. Here are companies that have 25 points of margin and 50 points of RMAs, meaning they're operating at a loss. We're able to effectively work with them to guarantee 95% success rates for installation of their devices with the consumers. Now we had a business that ended up getting a 30x, 50x value multiple on exit because we solved the most core problem the device manufacturers were having with unsatisfied customers. So sometimes finding that in the mix is super critical, and that's the thing with product market fit. It's not always exactly that. You've got to find the other players along the way.
Yeah. Can I just also
go on, Robin.
This balance between painting a vision, a strategy, kind of laying something that's really big and broad, and yet then focusing on something fairly narrow. And it's always important to know your audience.
Yep.
And, maybe when you're in front of venture capitalists, it's really about the big grandiose vision. I would say a way to connect those two things that has worked pretty effectively for me in the past is to think about maybe here's the big vision, but it's a journey to the vision.
It's a staircase. Yeah,
that's right. So you can have that conversation with customers. You can paint the big vision and you can say, but typically what I see is customers get started at point A. And then you're into point A, and now you can talk about that use case. And now you're really in a product market fit in this more narrow area. But I would just remember, you do need both. You need the big picture because companies don't want to, you got to be careful if it's too narrow. One, you're boxed in and you can't scale and add more use cases. Or two, they just don't perceive you're relevant long-term and they don't want to solve some tiny point problem when they got really, really big things. So you're walking a pretty fine line here.
No, I think that's very well said. And I think it's the classic challenge for startup founders, which is you do have to sell a dream. You have to sell a broad vision because even the buyers want to partner with companies where they feel like they can have a decade-long journey. Adding a new vendor is hard. It's a lot of risk. There's a lot of downside. No one gets fired for buying IBM, although these days that's changed. But still, proverbially, it's a high risk thing to work with an early stage company. And so you do have to sell that long-term dream. And at the same time, you've got to solve a very specific problem. You've got to do something for the buyer that will make them a hero in their organization, will give them their promotion tomorrow, or will solve sort of a pain point which makes them look, changes something for them in the immediate term. And I think that balance is hard. But I think as both of you have said, it is the critical ingredient for startup success and for finding product market fit. I'm going to transition a little bit to talking about demand gen. Typically the first million or a couple of million in revenues for most companies is really about founder-led sales. You're discovering use cases, you're discovering your positioning, you're discovering what product market fit looks like. And at some point when you have, and it'll depend on company to company, but you have, if you have large deals, tens of customers, if you have mid-sized deals, maybe closer to 100 customers, but you'll be at the point when you now need to step on the gas and you're ready to go from a few million in revenues to 100 million in revenues. And that's really about building a demand gen machine. It's something most founders struggle with. It's not something they know much about. Both of you have done this many times over. I'd love to get your thoughts on how should founders go about building demand gen?
Well, I'll jump in, Peter, and you add as you go. First of all, every company is different. And everybody wants pipeline. Everybody wants demand gen. So just be a little careful that you don't look at this as a really narrow to-do list. And our engineering DNA sometimes likes things really black and white. Okay,
Yep.
It's time for demand gen. Let's turn it on. It's a continuum. Really at the heart of demand gen is getting customers through kind of a process of consuming your brand, understanding who you are, what you do, why you matter, what's interesting to them, where would it be relevant in their organization, who do they know that likes this. It's just kind of like, think of it a bit of as a continuum. And I think it's, to me, and it depends obviously your consumer or your mid-market or big enterprise, but it's about engagement. How are you engaging your target customer? And then ultimately to decide when have you created demand, it's just a continuum. Well, where on this engagement curve do I feel like they're hot enough, warm enough? I want to now throw a different set of resources at it. I want to actually have someone pick up a phone or call or do something. So just my first caution is just be a little careful. You don't think it's kind of cookie cutter, like program, throw some stuff on the web and now we have a demand gen campaign. It's really about engagement.
I'll add to that. And I love the perspective you're bringing, Robin, because it's the number one flaw I see a lot of startup leaders do from a demand gen perspective is they associate demand gen with lead and pipeline. And what ends up happening, especially in your first 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, you've got about 5 or 6 sellers. They're not following up on those leads. You're filling a pipeline to create noise for them versus actually helping them, go do really creative things in their own Rolodex or through their own markets and relationships, et cetera. So I think it's important to recognize that the classic demand gen that founders most of the time are thinking about, you shouldn't even be looking at that in the first 50 million, to be quite honest with you. There are so many other ways to generate that interest and engagement. And I think a big thing, especially in today's day and age around cloud, self-service, infrastructure consumption models, is to take very much a product-led growth strategy, right? Figure out how to remove all the friction from getting a developer or someone to be able to engage and use your stuff. Remove all the gates, remove all the things that say, give me this and I'll give you that. Just give it to them and let them come and engage. And what you'll find is along that journey, they will start to self-select when they want to hear from you. And as you go down that path, you'll build better relationships, better trust, and be able to have real conversations with the customer. The funnel we follow is literally, how do you get from registration to meaningful use to meaningful spend to, fully converted. It's somewhere in that meaningful use and meaningful spend part where it truly becomes a lead generation exercise where you're engaging your sellers. But up until then, using a product-led growth strategy, you can actually really kind of foster the journey of the customer without too much intimidation or too much selling. Developer advocates play a big role here. Community engagements, product heroes, people willing to go support customers in getting to that success will drive more lead engagements or more demand engagements than a classic demand gen program. We saw it actually. I mean, a great example is at cloud.com. I think 0 to 25 million at most. We had 5 sellers. We had no marketer. So you didn't want to go do those types of big, broad programs. But what we found was, as our 5 sellers were landing those key accounts that they had relationships with or were working, on their own inbound efforts with, we would surround them with our QA team, our engineers, to go in and once they got a customer that was interested in trying things, we would load them up with free services to get up and running. It wasn't your high cost professional services. It wasn't any of the other classic models. It was literally, how do I remove all the friction, learn how you are engaging, get you to be successful, and then step back and see what happens. And it was literally key to our model for growth, and our model to do that growth without having to have huge expenditures in marketing or pre-sales or any of those other things.
Just to kind of add, there's a couple things. First of all, there's no one size fits all for companies. Yep. So product-led growth assumes that your target customer can kind of self-serve, and you can create an experience where that is a viable path to onboard and use your technology. Some of you might be dealing with a little bit higher touch or higher decision makers who aren't the type. So it really does depend on your strategy, your business. And I think that's one of the most important things, is to get really savvy about the way customers consume your tech and making sure you're thinking through that specific experience and journey. And if it can be a complete hands-free kind of thing, and then great, that's where you could really drive interesting scale by doing the things Peter's talking about, removing friction. If you need still a pretty high level of engagement, you might need to be, kind of nursing some just consumption of content, and they're kind of getting more savvy. And then maybe you need a high touch. Maybe you need an account-based marketing kind of strategy, because there's 100 accounts that are going to make or break your business. And so you want a very high touch kind of approach. So anyway, my main point is just, it's not a one size fits all. It's really important you get really savvy about your customers' consumption behavior, their triggers, and then how your product can be consumed, or your service, and where are the friction points, what can you remove, automate, and maybe what do you need. And by the way, the evolution of the MarTech and sales tech stack underneath this is one of the places of incredible innovation. And you probably need to be at the very forefront of that, making sure, you're not behind in your own consumption of these sales tech and MarTech technologies, because frankly, your go-to-market you'll start out behind the gate.
Yeah, no, I think well said. And I think one of the things I've seen is it does require some upfront investment, both of time and resources, because, Peter, as you said, the engagement you do at the top of the funnel doesn't necessarily result in leads tomorrow. So if founders are thinking, hey, I'm going to start some marketing activity, and 3 months from now, I'm going to have lots of leads, lo and behold, you're going to be disappointed. It's a process, and you have to get the engagement up front. Some of the folks that engage will then start, using the product in a way that's actually driving some business value for them. And at that point, there's an opportunity to go do a commercial contract with some meaningful dollars. Peter, you were at the heart of both at MongoDB and AWS, there's really this, what's considered an art has really been refined into a science of product-led growth. Any lessons along the way, if you had to pick one or two things, you say, look, these are things we did really well, and, one or two mistakes we made that you can share with founders so they don't make the same mistakes?
Yeah. So interesting. My portfolio at Amazon, what would I say? I probably had about 50 to 60% of the entire service portfolio. So out of 235 services, I was managing about 100 and some odd, ranging from, classic developer tools, Kubernetes, containers, serverless, IDEs, et cetera, all the way through big, complex enterprise capabilities from management governance, or even the VMware solution on AWS. That was under my purview, the whole enterprise transformation. When I look to the areas where the product-led growth was really key, it really came down to, in this case, our users were developers. They didn't want to engage with sellers. They wanted to understand how to become self-sufficient fairly early on, et cetera. So everything we did from a product marketing perspective was oriented around connecting with the customer, connecting with the developer, enabling them with capabilities, thoughts, et cetera, that they could use in order to be successful. We put less of a focus on classic demand gen programs, if you will. In fact, if I were to look at my field programs all up, maybe we hit 1% of total net new revenue. Everything was done by using kind of that product-led growth strategy of removing friction, enabling the developers access to code, best practices, snippets, et cetera, showing up in all of their communities, and ensuring they had that kind of that hug that helped them know that whatever they were doing was going to work out just fine, and we were going to make them successful. We have the same thing at MongoDB. In fact, you look at from not just our open source downloads, but the free tiers that we have in our Atlas product. It's all about getting the developer to some level of productivity or sustainability on their own. So using tools like free tiers and best practices and templates and snippets, whether it was MongoDB or at AWS, has been hugely beneficial in getting that developer down that path to meaningful use and meaningful spend. I think the biggest flaw that can be a gotcha in this is misrepresenting when you want to get the sellers involved, right? Because in many times, and I've seen this both at AWS and at MongoDB, you got a seller that wants to sell a Ferrari to a guy standing on the corner hailing a cab. Sure, he might want that Ferrari, but he's in no position
He doesn't have budget
to go do it. Right. So it's really, it's not only managing your developer through that experience and making them successful, but also making sure that the traditional triggers you have don't go off early to where you're spooking them and sending them in the wrong direction. And I think that's been the key. Remove all blockers, remove all friction, focus on making your developers successful and self-sustainable, and then engage when they hit that meaningful use, meaningful spend position.
Ashu, can I add
please. And I definitely wanted you to, Robin, add also sort of the difference between more of a PLG, model and, traditional IT-centric GTM, because that's still so relevant for so many companies.
Right. I just want to add a little bit of a boring tactic to Peter's point, but I think it's so important. When you are small like you are now, you will never, ever again have the opportunity to build your foundation and go to market from a fresh and kind of clean slate.
Yeah.
Think about I'm talking customer facing now. Yeah. Think about your data architecture. Think about how you tag your data. Think about the processes of how your data flows, evolves. How do you deal with your opt-in things? How does your marketing database and your sales implementation, your Salesforce implementation work together? Look at the seams in your technologies and your MarTech and sales tech stack. I can tell you that the investments now are tiny, tiny, tiny compared to fixing the mess that will be down the road if you don't invest. And I'm sure most of your founder CEOs are engineers and they're bright technically. Help these teams get out of the gate with the right kind of foundation, because it is a mess. And I will tell you, at VMware, multi-billion-dollar company, that was, from a marketing's perspective, that was like a boat anchor around my neck. Our data was so messy. Our systems were siloed. I couldn't get insight from this system to that system. So I therefore couldn't, at scale, automate anything. So I just want to send that word of advice. Please do it well now while it's small and manageable.
I think well said, Robin. In fact, I almost always advise founders that if you can afford it, and once you have, tens of customers, you mostly can get someone who really understands the marketing technology, whether that person is a marketing technologist or a marketing ops person. Different people have different titles, but getting that marketing and sales tech infrastructure right is so critical. And you need someone who gets it. I mean, you need a person. It doesn't happen by itself. It requires.
It's really food and water. Down the road, it is your food and water. So you definitely need it.
Absolutely. Before we wrap up, we got a couple of questions around hiring a marketing leader. I mean, this has definitely been a hot topic. We had questions in the last session as well. Would love to get both of your perspectives. The question is, when you're recruiting the marketing leader, how do you balance positioning and more product marketing and strategic skills with demand gen skills? And this is really in the context of a company that has product market fit, think maybe north of 10 million in revenues, 100 plus customers. So they're beyond that point, but there's still work to do in positioning and product marketing, as we talked about. But demand gen is a real critical priority for them. How would you make those trade-offs?
You want to go, Peter? We'll see.
Yeah, I can go.
Conflict or not?
Yeah, no, I can go, and I think I'm a little biased, but I think you can do a lot with a really good product marketing leader, someone who can basically draw that tangible line between the technology and the business outcome and play the content lead or the voice for what you're trying to go solve. And when you're thinking about that first 100 customers or first 25, 50 million, strong sales team, strong awareness and engagement out in the various communities, and strong, product marketing will solve a lot of the initial things that you're doing. The other stuff, you can leverage partner systems. You can leverage agencies for PR/AR. You can leverage agencies even for some of the brand and digital creative stuff. The biggest mistake I see is startups, even in that first 100 million, they'll over-rotate and do paid display ads and SEO and all of the classic things that actually aren't generating the right level of engagement from a customer perspective. So I would say start with product marketing. Everything can somewhat be outsourced. Second, to Robin's point, your second most critical hire will be the MarTech stack, because the data and the automation is going to drive all of the things for where you want to go. And then third becomes that scale mechanism. Now, as you've hit that 50 to 100, 100 plus, now you start knowing exactly how to invest. Is it region specific? Do you have to over-rotate to digital because you're really going down a product-led growth strategy, or do you invest in traditional demand gen capabilities? But I'm of the mindset, and it's worked for me in the first few startups I've done, that's actually not the first area you invest. You invest in building the foundation and the core that enables you to scale, and then double down on scale once you get that correct.
Thanks, Peter. Robin, anything you would add before we wrap up?
I mean, first of all, I 100% agree. I think product marketing is the most important kind of foundational, and getting a great product marketer who is technical enough to engage with your engineering, your product management teams, but businessy enough to engage with your sellers and your customers. And it's easier for those guys to experiment and start kind of building your demand gen than it is for your demand gen teams to start getting really good at deep product positioning and messaging and into like competitive analysis. So 1000% agree. And I also agree on that tipping then into that a strong digital person who gets the stack, maybe can play multiple roles. It would be a really close number two, but I'm with you, Peter. Well said.
I think that's super helpful, and I couldn't agree more. I think especially for infrastructure software companies where the story is complex and there is a lot of nuance, I think if you don't get product marketing right, it doesn't matter what you do in demand gen.
You got to get great product. I mean, one thing about product marketing is you can get someone who is too Puritan in product marketing and they just don't get outside their sandbox. That wouldn't be what I'm talking about. I'm talking about someone who has the DNA of a product marketer, but has the potential to be broader. To be
much broader, and to be the marketing leader. No, I think that's super helpful. Well, Peter, Robin, this has been a fabulous conversation. I mean, we've gone from, positioning, product market fit, recruiting, all in a span of 45 minutes. So thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for being part of FC Build.
You bet. It's so fun. It makes me think about coming out of retirement.
Well, Robin, I have a couple of ideas for you.
Oh, good. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.